The sound of footsteps echoed through the long hallways of the Volkov mansion. It was midnight, and Artyom, with his fists clenched and his jaw set, walked toward his office. The betrayal by Ira Sokolova was still an open wound, throbbing in his memory. He had loved her deeply, but she had left him for Pavel Ivanov, his biggest rival. It wasn't just the personal pain that gnawed at him, but the public humiliation. He needed revenge. And now he had a plan. As the cold wind of the night hissed through the windows, Artyom poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat in his leather armchair. The golden glow of the liquid contrasted with his cold gaze. He needed someone who represented everything Ira despised, someone simple, outside the world of high society. His thoughts soon turned to Daria Morozova, the gardener who worked on his estate. The next morning, Daria was kneeling in one of the rose beds, struggling to save a plant that seemed to be wilting. Hard work was a constant in her life, but she never complained. Taking care of Artyom's garden was an escape from the harsh reality she faced at home: her mother's debilitating illness, the piling bills, the suffocating feeling of having no options. The sky was clear, but the biting wind made her hands shake, even though they were protected by gloves. Daria. Artyom's deep, authoritative voice startled her. She looked up, meeting the eyes of the man who rarely spoke to her. His gaze was impenetrable, and she didn't know what he wanted. "I need to talk to you." Now, in the office, Daria sat uneasily at the edge of the chair while Artyom watched her. He was imposing, and the severe expression on his face made her stomach churn. When he finally broke the silence, his words were so absurd that she thought she had misheard. "I want you to marry me." Daria's reaction was immediate. She laughed, a brief and nervous sound, but when she saw the seriousness in Artyom's face, her laughter died. "Is this some kind of joke?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "It's not a joke. It's a deal. I will pay all of your mother's medical expenses and ensure that you and she will never need to worry about money again. In exchange, you will be my wife for a year." Daria blinked, trying to process what he was saying. It felt surreal. "Why? Why me?" Artyom stood up, walking over to the window. He had no intention of revealing the sordid details of his plan to her. All that mattered was that she said yes. "You're simple, honest. Everything I need for a specific purpose. It's a marriage of convenience." Nothing more. Indignation and fear mixed inside Daria. The proposal was humiliating, but she knew her mother needed urgent treatment, something she could never afford with her salary. She wanted to say no. She wanted to leave and pretend this conversation had never happened. But the image of her mother, frail and bedridden, wouldn't leave her mind. "I need to think." Her voice was weak, almost a whisper. "Don't take too long." Artyom's reply was cold, but there was a hint of relief. He knew she would accept. 2 days later, Daria returned to Artyom's office. Her eyes were tired, but her expression was firm. "I accept." Those words came out of her mouth like a sentence. Artyom barely reacted, simply getting up and grabbing a document. He handed it to Daria, explaining that it was the prenuptial agreement. "Sign this and get ready. We're getting married on Saturday." The wedding was a small event, held in the mansion's garden. Daria wore a simple white dress, borrowed from a friend, while Artyom wore a perfectly tailored suit. She felt every gaze from the few guests, mostly Artyom's employees, like a blade cutting into her skin. But she stood tall, head held high. If she was going to be humiliated, at least she would do so with dignity. Artyom, on the other hand, was focused. Ira would surely hear about the wedding. He knew his ex-fiancée wouldn't be able to resist the curiosity of finding out who he had chosen to replace her. At the end of the ceremony, While the makeshift photographer took one last picture of the couple, Artyom extended his hand to Daria. She hesitated, but accepted the gesture. His touch was warm, but empty of affection. For her, that marriage was a burden. For him, it was just the beginning of his revenge. When night fell and the quiet party ended, Daria retreated to the room assigned to her in the mansion. As she stared at the ceiling, the tears finally came. In that moment, she didn't know that the marriage, which had started as a game of revenge, was about to transform not only her life, but also the heart of Artyom Volkov. The sun shone through the stained glass windows of the lavish ballroom, where a charity event organized by the local high society was underway. It was Artyom and Daria's first public appearance as a couple, and he knew Ira would be there. The anticipation of seeing her again filled him with a mix of tension and dark satisfaction. He wanted her to see, to understand, and above all, to feel the weight of being replaced. Daria, on the other hand, felt her heart heavy as she adjusted the elegant dress Artyom had ordered her to buy for the occasion. Though beautiful, the outfit didn't feel like her. Every movement was a reminder that she didn't belong in this luxurious environment. Still, she held her head high and took a deep breath, determined to maintain her dignity. The ballroom was crowded, with women in stunning dresses and men in impeccable suits. When Artyom entered, leading Daria by the arm, conversations ceased for a brief moment. All attention turned to them. Artyom's haughty expression was unreadable, but Daria could feel every evaluative glance, every muffled whisper. On the other side of the room, Ira Sokolova held a glass of champagne, her eyes fixed on the couple. She looked stunning, wearing a red dress that attracted gazes wherever she went. When her eyes met Artyom's, she smiled with a challenging air, raising her glass as if toasting to him. Artyom tilted his head slightly in response, but ignored the gesture. He squeezed Daria's arm lightly, guiding her through the room with the confidence of someone who knew they were being watched. Later that evening, as Daria sought refuge at the buffet table, trying to avoid the scrutiny of the guests, Ira approached Artyom. Her proximity was an obvious provocation. "So, Artyom," she began with a cold smile, "I heard you got married. Congratulations." Her voice was laced with irony. He kept his gaze fixed on her, offering no sign of weakness. "Yes, Daria is an extraordinary woman. Completely different from the kind of people I used to associate with." The insinuation in his reply made Ira's smile falter, but she quickly recovered. "Extraordinary." She glanced over at Daria, who was on the other side of the room, trying to avoid curious looks. "She seems simple, yes, and genuine. Something you'd never understand." Artyom's response was sharp. Ira narrowed her eyes but kept her smile. "Careful, darling. Some say those who play with fire end up getting burned." She lightly touched Artyom's shoulder before walking away, leaving a heavy perfume in the air. Meanwhile, Daria was facing a different battle. A small group of women, led by Sofia Ivanovna, a close friend of Ira's, approached her with fake smiles. "You're Daria, right? The new Mrs. Volkov?" Sofia asked, her voice too sweet to be sincere. Daria nodded, feeling her cheeks flush. "How lovely. It must be difficult for you to adjust to this world, right? I mean, you were a gardener, weren't you?" The words stung like thorns, but Daria forced a smile. "Yes, and I'm still in love with plants. They're simple and sincere. Very different from some people I've met today." The group was momentarily speechless, and Daria took the opportunity to walk away, feeling a mix of nervousness and relief for not letting herself be intimidated. The main confrontation came later when Daria, unwittingly, found herself face to face with Ira in a more secluded corner of the ballroom. The tension was palpable. "So, You're the woman Artyom chose? Ira began, her eyes scanning Darya from head to toe. I must admit, I'm surprised. He has unusual taste. Darya, though nervous, responded firmly. It seems he decided to change his taste. Perhaps because the old one no longer satisfied him, the direct response surprised Ira, who narrowed her eyes but had no chance to reply. Artyom appeared next to Darya, placing his hand on her back. Is there a problem, Ira? His voice was icy. Of course not, she smiled, though discomfort was evident. Just introducing myself to your wife. Great. Darya is my priority now. He spoke firmly, making it clear there was no room for Ira. She walked away with a bitter smile, but inside, she was burning with rage. Ira was determined not to let things end like this. When the night ended, Darya and Artyom returned to the mansion in silence. In the car, she finally spoke. Why did you bring me here? I don't belong to this world, and you know it. Artyom, who had spent the night battling his own emotions, responded evasively. You're with me now. That's enough. Darya looked away, feeling lonelier than ever, while Artyom stared out the window, trying to ignore the growing guilt forming inside him. The Volkov mansion was immersed in silence that winter morning. The snow blanketed the gardens that Darya used to tend to, but now she rarely went there. Her new life as Artyom's wife was confusing and lonely, and the weight of their marriage of convenience made each day harder. She spent her hours trying to keep busy, but the solitude crushed her. Artyom, on the other hand, was becoming increasingly intrigued by the woman he had chosen for his plan. Darya's quiet strength, her resilience to the humiliations of high society, and her bluntness were beginning to penetrate the armor of his indifference. That morning, Artyom found Darya in the kitchen, a place she often sought refuge. She was standing by the stove, preparing tea, while the aroma of freshly baked bread filled the air. You never use the servant's service, he commented, entering the kitchen. His tone was casual, but there was genuine curiosity behind it. Darya turned to him, surprised by his unexpected presence. I feel more comfortable this way. Doing something with my own hands helps me. Think. Artyom watched her in silence for a few seconds. She was far from the type of woman he usually admired, but there was something in her authenticity that disarmed him. He stepped closer, pouring himself a cup of tea that she had made. You're different from anyone I know, Darya. The words escaped him before he could hold them back. She chuckled softly, though without humor. That sounds like a polite way of saying I don't belong in this world. Artyom lifted his eyes to meet hers, noticing the bitterness in her voice. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Darya challenged him, though her voice wasn't aggressive. There was weariness, yes, and a hint of curiosity. Artyom didn't answer right away. He knew his words carried more weight than he was willing to admit. Instead, he changed the subject, but he couldn't help feeling a growing admiration for the strength of this woman. The days that followed brought unexpected moments. Even though the marriage was a facade, Artyom began spending more time with Darya. He found her in the gardens, shoveling snow from the paths, even when it wasn't necessary. When he asked why she insisted on doing it, she simply replied, "Taking care of this place reminds me of who I am." The answer touched something inside him. She wasn't trying to impress him or please him. Darya was simply herself, and her authenticity stood in brutal contrast to the superficiality he had known with Ira. One evening, during a solitary dinner, they ended up sharing. Artyom did something he never did. He asked about Darya's life. She told him about her simple childhood, the love she had for her mother, and the tragedy of losing her father at a young age. As she spoke, he realized that, for the first time in years, he was genuinely interested in someone else's story. Have you ever loved anyone? He asked abruptly. Daria looked up at him, surprised by the question. Yes, she answered honestly. But it was a long time ago, and it didn't work out. Artyom nodded, feeling a twinge of guilt. He knew she didn't see him as anything more than an obligation, and she was right. He was the one who had put her in this position. And you? She returned the question, catching him off guard. He hesitated. I loved, but it brought me more pain than joy. The answer hung in the air, laden with unsaid meanings. In that moment, Daria saw a glimpse of the man behind Artyom's impenetrable facade. He wasn't just cold and calculating. He had wounds, just like her. The next morning, Daria decided to return to the gardens. Despite the cold, she felt the need for that space to regain some balance. To her surprise, Artyom showed up, wearing a heavy coat. Need help? He asked, almost awkwardly. Daria laughed, unable to hide her surprise. You work in the garden. I find that hard to imagine, he shrugged. Maybe I want to try something new. Though hesitant, she accepted the help. And for the first time, they worked side by side, clearing dead leaves and adjusting the dormant plants beneath the snow. Time passed quickly, and they laughed together when Artyom, clearly inexperienced, stumbled and fell into the snow. At the end of the day, as the sun set and the mansion seemed warmer than ever, Daria felt something different. Artyom was still a complex and difficult figure, but there was a spark of humanity in him that she hadn't expected to find. That night, as Daria prepared to sleep, she found a flower in her room. It was a white rose, picked from the garden. Next to it was a simple note, written in Artyom's precise handwriting. Thank you for today. She held the flower for a long time, feeling an unexpected warmth in her chest. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to Artyom than she had imagined. The glow of the lights reflected off the crystal chandelier that adorned the luxurious ballroom of a charity event, the kind of environment where Artyom Volkov always shone. He was once again by Daria's side, who wore an elegant emerald green dress he had chosen for her. Though they appeared to be the perfect couple from a distance, Daria still felt the constant discomfort of being seen as an accessory in Artyom's plan. The weeks since the wedding had been a roller coaster of emotions. Artyom was changing, and Daria could see it. The moments when he lowered his guard and showed vulnerability were becoming more frequent, but the man she saw now was a paradox, both attentive and impenetrable. As much as she wanted to believe there was something real there, the shadow of their contractual position loomed over her. Ira Sokolova was at the event, as Artyom had predicted. Her presence was striking, and her strategy was clear. Use her beauty and charm to destabilize. She floated between the guests like a dancer on stage, casting calculated glances and smiles. Daria tried to avoid Ira as much as possible, but fate seemed to conspire to bring them face to face. During a break in the main speech, Ira approached with a venomous smile. Daria, she began, in a sweet voice, you look stunning tonight. It must be nice to have someone like Artyom to guide you through this new world. Daria knew it was a veiled insult, but kept her calm. Thank you, Ira. Indeed, I've learned a lot. It's an interesting world with even more interesting people. Ira raised an eyebrow, but before she could respond, Artyom appeared. He positioned himself between the two, casting a cold glare at Ira. Is there something you need, Ira? His tone was controlled, but the tension was palpable. Ira took a step back, but smiled maliciously. I was just being polite, Artyom. After all, we're old friends, aren't we? Old, yes. Friends, no, he replied coldly, leading Daria away. The night continued without major incidents, but the worst was yet to come. While Daria and Artyom conversed with other guests, a growing murmur spread throughout the ballroom. One of Artyom's assistants hurried toward him, whispering something in his ear. Artyom's expression immediately hardened. "We need to leave," he said to Daria, gripping her arm. "Why? What happened?" she asked, frightened. "Not now," he replied, his voice tense. Before they could leave the event, a tabloid journalist appeared in front of them with a microphone and a camera. "Mr. Volkov, what do you have to say about the rumors that your marriage is a deal? Sources close to you claim that your wife, Daria, was a gardener at your estate and was paid to marry you. Is that true?" Daria froze. The question hung in the air like thunder, and all eyes in the ballroom were fixed on them. Artyom tightened his grip on Daria's arm, as if trying to protect her from the impact. "No comment," he said coldly, pushing the microphone away and guiding Daria toward the exit. But the damage was done. The murmurs in the ballroom turned into audible whispers, and Daria felt the tears threaten to fall as they walked out under the curious and judgmental gaze of everyone. Back at the safety of the mansion, Daria collapsed. She wasn't the type of person to cry easily, but the public humiliation and the sense of being a pawn in Artyom's revenge game were overwhelming. "Why did you put me in this position?" she screamed, staring at Artyom with tears in her eyes. "I never wanted this. You threw me into this world to prove a point, and now I'm the one paying the price." Artyom looked shaken, but his expression remained rigid. "I'll deal with this. I'll figure out who leaked the information and handle it." "Handle it? That doesn't solve anything for me," she retorted. "You don't understand what it's like to be humiliated like this, used as a pawn in your game." Her words hit him like a knife. He knew she was right, but he was so used to controlling everything that he didn't know how to fix it. "Daria," he began, his voice softer than she expected, "I never wanted you to be hurt. I didn't think things would get this far." "Exactly," she replied, pulling away from him. "You didn't think. You only thought about yourself." The next morning, Daria found the garden covered in snow, but she decided to work on it anyway. It was the only place where she felt at peace. As she pulled up dead leaves, Artyom appeared, wearing a thick coat. "I want to fix this," he said, without preamble. "And how are you going to do that? Are you going to pay someone to bury the story? Are you going to hide me until everyone forgets?" Daria asked, still not looking at him. "No," he replied, approaching. "I'll deal with it differently." Daria stood up and finally faced him. "If you want to fix anything, Artyom, start by being honest. With me and with yourself." Her gaze was firm, but there was no anger, just exhaustion. Artyom felt something inside him break. He realized that, for the first time in his life, he didn't have control, and it scared him. Later that day, Artyom received word that Ira would be at an important social event. He knew she had something to do with the leak. Determined, he began to plan his next move, but for the first time, he hesitated. Was his revenge against Ira worth more than the pain he was causing Daria? The doubt gnawed at him, and he knew he was at a turning point. Night fell over the Volkov mansion, but the atmosphere felt heavier than ever. Daria sat in her room, her gaze lost in the darkness beyond the window. The public scandal had not only ruined her reputation, but also made her question her decision to enter this marriage. Worse still, she was beginning to develop feelings for Artyom that she couldn't comprehend. Between anger and disappointment, there was something deeper, something that scared her. Artyom sat in his office, staring at the whiskey glass he had barely touched. Daria's words echoed in his mind. If you want to fix something, start by being honest. He knew she was right. The plan that once seemed perfect now felt empty, cruel. The pain in Darya's eyes mirrored the guilt he had been accumulating, something he had tried to ignore for weeks. The next morning, Darya decided to go for a walk in the garden, despite the biting cold. The plants dormant under the snow reminded her of her own life, paralyzed, waiting for something that might never happen. She found Artyom there, as had happened before, but this time he seemed different. There was no usual arrogance in his posture. He looked tired, vulnerable. "Darya," he began, his voice low, hesitant. "I need to talk to you." She crossed her arms, protecting herself more from the wind than from him. "What now? Another brilliant idea to fix your revenge?" He shook his head, looking down at the ground. "No, I just want to apologize." Darya's eyes widened. The words took her by surprise. Artyom had never shown anything close to regret. "Apologize? Why?" she asked, a mixture of skepticism and curiosity in her voice. "For everything." He lifted his eyes to meet hers. "For using you in this stupid plan. For not thinking about the impact it would have on your life. For being a man who only knows how to control and manipulate things." Darya fell silent for a moment, processing his words. It was the first time she had seen Artyom admit his flaws, and that sparked something unexpected in her: empathy. "Artyom," she began, softer than she intended, "I didn't enter this marriage by choice, but I accepted it because I needed to. And I thought I knew what to expect. But what you did exposed me to something I never wanted. I don't know if I can forgive that." He nodded, accepting her words as a blow he knew he deserved. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I'll prove I'm capable of change." In the days that followed, Artyom began to act differently. He slowed down at work, spending more time at the mansion. He awkwardly tried to be present. When Darya was in the garden, he would show up to help, even though he didn't know exactly what he was doing. When she walked through the hall, he surprised her with genuine questions about her mother and childhood. Darya noticed the change, but she didn't want to let herself be deceived. It was hard to believe that the man who had put her in this position was the same one now trying to learn how to care for a plant just to be near her. One afternoon, while both were working in the garden, Darya began to feel lightheaded. She tried to ignore it, but the sensation quickly worsened. Before she could call for help, she collapsed. Artyom, who was only a few meters away, ran to her, catching her before she hit the ground. "Darya, Darya," he called, desperate, as he tried to wake her. He carried her inside the mansion, calling for a doctor immediately. When she woke up, she was lying in her bed, with Artyom sitting beside her, holding her hand. "What happened?" she asked, confused. "You fainted," he replied, his voice full of concern. "The doctor is on his way." The doctor arrived shortly after, conducting a series of questions and quick exams. After a few minutes of analysis, he smiled faintly. "Congratulations," the doctor said, looking at Darya and then at Artyom. "You're pregnant." The silence that followed was deafening. Darya was speechless, trying to process the information. Artyom, on the other hand, seemed petrified. Pregnant? He had never considered that possibility, nor imagined what it would mean for their future. "I need a moment," Darya murmured, looking at the doctor. The doctor nodded, gathered his things, and left, leaving the couple alone. After a few minutes of silence, Artyom spoke. "I didn't know that this was possible. I didn't think." "Neither did I," Darya interrupted, her voice trembling. "This changes everything, Darya," he said, moving closer. "I know you don't trust me now, and you have every reason not to. But I want to do this right. I want to be a father, I want to be someone you can trust." She looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. There was a new urgency there, a desire for change that seemed genuine. But fear still dominated her. "This isn't about words, Artyom. It's about actions. If you want to prove you're different, you'll have to do more than just talk." He nodded. "I know, and I will prove it." That night, Darya barely slept, while Artyom spent hours in his office, reflecting. For the first time in his life, he felt that something bigger than his thirst for revenge was at stake. It wasn't just Darya, but the child she carried. He realized that he would need to change, not just to earn her respect, but to be someone his future child could be proud of. The plan for revenge against Ira, which once seemed so important, now seemed hollow. Artyom knew that his priority had shifted. Now he needed to fight for the family he was unexpectedly beginning to form. The days following the revelation of the pregnancy were a whirlwind of emotions for both Artyom and Darya. They tried to find a new balance, but while Darya remained cautious and reserved, Artyom was determined to show that his transformation was real. He dedicated every free moment to preparing for the future, reorganizing his life to prioritize Darya and the baby. However, the shadows of the past still loomed over them. Ira Sokolova, furious to see her emotional control over Artyom slip away, was unwilling to retreat. She was planning a final blow, something that would not only ruin the facade marriage, but also irreparably destroy Artyom and Darya's reputation. A week later, during a charity event Artyom had organized at his mansion, Ira appeared uninvited, her presence radiating tension. She was confident, carrying a dossier that she claimed contained proof that Artyom and Darya's marriage was a sham. With the press present, Ira saw the perfect opportunity to cause a public scandal. Darya, who was at the event at Artyom's insistence, felt out of place, but knew she had to keep up appearances. However, when she saw Ira crossing the hall with a venomous smile on her lips, she knew something was about to happen. Ira demanded the floor, interrupting the ceremony. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, with a voice full of false cordiality, "I believe everyone here deserves to know the truth." Artyom immediately stood up, his eyes burning with rage. "Ira, you are not welcome here." She ignored the warning, holding the dossier up in front of everyone. "The truth is, this marriage you are all celebrating is a fraud." Artyom hired Darya, a mere gardener, to pretend to be his wife. "All of this was a scheme to hurt me." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Artyom and Darya. Darya felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. She looked at Artyom, waiting for him to say something, anything, to protect her. But before he could respond, Darya stepped forward. "Yes," she said, her voice firm, though her hands trembled. "I was a gardener. And yes, our marriage began as a contract. But what Ira doesn't know, or refuses to admit, is that things have changed." Everyone was in shock at her confession, but Darya continued. "I won't pretend everything was perfect. I was used, and I made the mistake of accepting this out of desperation. But Artyom is not the same man who started this plan. He has changed. And I have changed." She turned to Artyom, her eyes filled with emotion. "I don't need you to defend me. I need you to be honest." Artyom, filled with a mix of pride and guilt, approached Darya, took her hand, and turned to the guests. "Everything she said is true," he declared, his voice firm but laden with emotion. "I made mistakes. I made this marriage happen for the wrong reasons, driven by revenge. But what began as a contract has become so much more. I've learned from Darya what it means to be true, what it means to value something beyond power and appearance." He looked directly at Ira. "You wanted to destroy what we've built, but you cannot destroy something that is real. I don't care what society thinks. My priority is my family. Daria and our child. The room erupted in murmurs. But before Ira could react, Artyom's security escorted her out. She tried to protest, but was ignored. Her final move had failed, and she was now completely isolated. After the event, Artyom and Daria stood in the mansion's garden, the same place where everything had begun. The soft lights illuminated the plants covered in snow, and the silence between them was full of meaning. "Why did you do that?" Daria asked, looking at him. "You could have lied, protected your reputation, because I don't want to live a lie anymore," he replied, holding her hands. "I want our child to know that his father is a man who learned to be honest. And I want you to know that, for the first time, I am sincere." Daria saw the truth in his eyes, and although doubts and wounds remained, she knew something fundamental had changed. Months later, the birth of Misha Volkov brought new light into their lives. On the day of the baptism, Artyom made an emotional speech before friends and family. "My life has always been about control, power, and revenge," he began. "But the arrival of Daria and Misha has taught me that true strength lies in honesty, love, and sacrifice. I've made many mistakes, but today, looking at my wife and my son, I know I am a better man because of them." Daria, listening to those words, felt the last barriers of her heart begin to crumble. She held Artyom's hand, this time not out of obligation, but by choice. The story ended in the garden, where Artyom, Daria, and Misha were together, surrounded by flowers that were finally beginning to bloom with the arrival of spring. What had started as a farce had become something real, built on challenges and transformations. There, in the middle of the garden, Daria and Artyom finally found the peace they had both been seeking, not only with each other, but with themselves. Did you enjoy this story full of twists and emotions? If it touched you in any way, don't forget to like the video to help us keep bringing more content like this. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any updates, and let us know in the comments, what would you do in Daria's place? We'd love to hear your opinion.